The screen behind him turned red with lost figures that made the entire room go silent. My boss Pierce Reynolds stood at the front of the conference room, his expression grave and disappointed as he clicked through the presentation showing how badly the Stratton deal had collapsed. $3 million in expected revenue gone. Client relationship damaged, possibly beyond repair. And then he said my name like a verdict being delivered. Alizia made critical errors in judgment that led to this outcome. She mishandled the deal despite multiple warnings. Chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one asked questions or requested clarification. I felt every eye in that room slide away from me like I'd become toxic to look at directly. The senior leadership team sat at the main table. The VP of operations, the regional director, the head of client relations. All of them were listening to Pierce calmly sacrifice me to save himself. To rewrite recent history so thoroughly that my mistakes became the explanation for a disaster I'd actually tried to prevent. He continued talking, his voice steady and authoritative, explaining how he tried to guide me, how I'd been resistant to feedback, how ultimately my inexperience and poor decision-making had created problems he couldn't fix in time. Every word was a lie, but delivered with such confidence that people were nodding along, accepting his version of events without question. My mouth opened. I wanted to interrupt, to correct the record immediately while everyone was still in the room, to present the actual timeline of decisions and approvals. But nothing came out. Because if I spoke now, emotional, defensive, interrupting my boss in front of senior leadership, I'd look exactly like what he was painting me as. Unstable. Poor judgment. Unable to accept accountability. If I stayed quiet, I looked guilty. Like someone who knew the accusations were true and had no defense. Either choice felt like a trap. So I chose silence. Forced myself to sit still with my hands folded on the table in front of me. My face as neutral as I could make it while betrayal sank deep into my chest like a physical weight. Pierce finished his presentation. Thanked everyone for their time. Suggested we'd need to have serious conversations about accountability and process improvements going forward. The meeting ended with people gathering their laptops and notebooks, avoiding looking at me as they filed out. I sat there for an extra moment, letting the room empty around me, feeling that betrayal settle into something colder and harder, something that felt less like hurt and more like determination. Because sitting through that presentation, listening to Pierce lie so smoothly about what had actually happened, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let this stand. I wasn't going to accept blame for failures that weren't mine. I was going to fight back. Just not the way he expected. I am Alizia Thornton. I'd been a senior project lead at Cascade Solutions for 4 years, known specifically for precision and thorough follow-through on complex deals. I didn't miss approval checkpoints. I didn't improvise risk strategies without consulting leadership. I didn't make unilateral decisions on multi-million-dollar contracts. My entire professional reputation was built on being careful, methodical, and communicative, which meant Pierce's characterization of me as someone who'd acted recklessly and ignored guidance wasn't just inaccurate. It was strategically chosen to be the opposite of who I actually was. That contradiction was important. It meant this wasn't confusion or miscommunication. This was deliberate strategy. Pierce had decided to blame me for the Stratton deal collapse, had crafted a narrative that made me responsible, and had delivered that narrative to senior leadership before I had any chance to defend myself or present alternative facts. The question I couldn't answer yet was why. Why sacrifice a team member who'd been reliable for years? Why create this fiction when the truth was documented in email trails and meeting notes? But sitting in that empty conference room, I realized the why didn't matter as much as the what. What actually happened? What was documented? What I could prove about who made which decisions and when. That evidence would matter more than understanding Pierce's motivations. I remembered the meeting clearly. It had been 3 weeks ago in Pierce's office. Just the two of us discussing the Stratton contract terms that the client had proposed. I'd printed out the proposal and highlighted several sections that concerned me. Pricing structures that didn't align with our usual margins. Delivery timelines that would strain our resources during an already busy quarter. Penalty clauses that seemed aggressive compared to our standard contracts. I'd walked Pierce through each concern methodically. Explained why I thought we should negotiate modifications before signing. Suggested specific changes we could propose that would protect our interests while still giving Stratton most of what they wanted. Pierce had listened, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled in that way he did when he was considering something. Then he'd waved off my concerns with a casual gesture. Stratton's been a good client for 2 years. We can absorb some margin compression to keep them happy. The timelines will be tight, but we'll make it work. The penalties are standard for contracts this size. Legal already reviewed them. It hesitated. Are you sure? I really think we should at least try to negotiate the delivery timeline. 6 weeks for full implementation seems. Move forward exactly as planned, Pierce had interrupted firmly. I've reviewed it. I'm approving these terms. Get the contract signed this week. That was the moment. The decision point. Pierce approving terms I'd explicitly warned him about. Telling me directly to proceed with a deal I'd said had problems. After the meeting where Pierce had blamed me publicly, I walked back to my desk through hallways that felt different than they had that morning. Co-workers I'd worked with for years avoided making eye contact when we passed. Conversations stopped when I approached. One person, Kendall from operations, whispered "I'm sorry" as she passed me in the hallway, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Wouldn't stop to actually talk or ask what had happened. Just that whispered apology and then she was gone, like being associated with me was professionally dangerous now. Pierce caught up with me before I reached my desk. Put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that probably looked supportive to anyone watching. His voice was low, almost kind. "Alesia, we should talk. My office, 10 minutes. It wasn't a request. I nodded and continued to my desk, feeling his hand fall away from my shoulder. Sat down and stared at my computer screen without really seeing it, processing what had just happened and what was likely about to happen. Pierce was going to have a private conversation with me now. After publicly blaming me in front of senior leadership. After establishing his narrative without giving me any chance to present my side. That sequencing told me something important about what this conversation would actually be. Not an honest discussion about what went wrong. A management of my response to what he'd already decided. 10 minutes later, I sat across from Pierce in his office. He closed the door and sat behind his desk. His expression serious but not hostile. Almost sympathetic. "I know that meeting was difficult for you," he began. "But leadership needed accountability. They needed to understand why this deal failed so spectacularly." I didn't respond. Just waited to hear what he'd actually brought me here to say. Pierce continued. His voice dropping lower like he was sharing something confidential. "The reality is that someone has to take responsibility when things go wrong. And given the decision chain on this project, that person is you. I need you to understand that fighting this isn't going to help either of us." The message was clear, even though he was being careful not to state it too explicitly. Accept the blame quietly or things would get worse. Don't challenge his narrative. Don't present alternative facts. Don't make this difficult. "I flagged concerns about those contract terms," I said quietly. 3 weeks ago. In this office. You approved moving forward anyway." Pierce's expression didn't change. "I have no record of you raising substantive concerns. What I remember is you being hesitant to close deals aggressively, which has been an ongoing coaching issue." Another lie. Delivered calmly. Rewriting history right in front of me. "You told me explicitly to proceed with the contract as written," I continued. "To get it signed that week." "That's not how I remember it," Pierce replied smoothly. "And unfortunately, memories differ. What matters is what leadership believes, and right now they believe you mishandled this. I'd suggest accepting that rather than creating more problems for yourself by disputing it." That night I didn't cry. Didn't call friends to vent about the injustice. Didn't write angry emails I'd later delete unsent. I opened my laptop at my kitchen table and started working methodically through what had actually happened versus what Pierce was claiming. If I was going down for this, if my career at Cascade was going to be destroyed by someone else's lies, it wouldn't be because I'd forgotten the truth or failed to document it properly. I started with my email archive, searched for all correspondence with Pierce about the Stratton deal, found the thread where I'd summarized our meeting, sent the same day we'd discussed the contract terms. The email was clear and specific. Per our discussion today, I want to confirm the concerns I raised about the Stratton contract terms before we proceed. As discussed, I recommended we negotiate modifications to the delivery timeline and penalty structures. You've decided to approve the contract as written. Please confirm this is correct so I can move forward with final signing. Pierce had replied within an hour. Confirmed. Proceed with signing this week. I sat staring at that email exchange, feeling cold certainty settle over me. This wasn't my word against his. This was documentation against ego. Pierce had apparently forgotten, or assumed I wouldn't use, the paper trail showing he'd made the decisions he was now blaming me for. That oversight was going to be his biggest mistake. I spent hours organizing everything into a chronological timeline. The email where I'd first raised concerns about the Stratton contract terms. The calendar invite for our meeting to discuss those concerns. My follow-up email confirming his approval to proceed. His written confirmation. The signed contract with metadata showing the date it was finalized. The same week Pierce had ordered me to get it signed. Status reports I'd sent weekly, detailing progress and flagging emerging problems with the aggressive timeline. Pierce's responses to those status reports, telling me to manage it and find solutions. Client communications showing Stratton's growing frustration with our inability to meet the timelines Pierce had approved against my advice. Everything was there. Every decision point. Every warning I'd given. Every approval Pierce had made. All of it time-stamped, saved in company systems, impossible to deny or modify without leaving obvious traces. I didn't edit anything. Didn't add emotional commentary about how Pierce's lies had made me feel. Just organized the facts in clear sequence with clean documentation. The story the evidence told was undeniable. I had identified problems, raised concerns, and been overruled by my boss who then blamed me when his decisions led to failure. I saved everything in a folder, made backup copies, and felt something shift inside me from hurt and betrayal to calm, focused determination. This was my defense. Not emotional arguments or accusations. Just facts, presented clearly, impossible to dispute without looking dishonest. The more I reviewed the documentation, the calmer I became. The initial shock and hurt from Pierce's public betrayal was being replaced by something more useful. Strategic clarity about what actually mattered in this situation. Pierce had authority and credibility with senior leadership. He'd worked at Cascade for 12 years, held a director position, had relationships with executives I'd barely interacted with. If this became a he said she said situation about what had been discussed or decided in private meetings, he'd win through seniority and establish trust. But this wasn't word against word. This was documentation against revisionist history. Email trails that showed exactly what I'd recommended and what he'd approved. Status reports proving I'd flagged problems early. Meeting notes and calendar invites establishing timelines that contradicted his narrative. The evidence was clean, clear, and completely supported my version of events while contradicting his. That meant power in this situation didn't come from authority or relationships. It came from having the truth documented irrefutably. Pierce had made his play using his positional advantage. Now I'd make mine using information advantage he didn't realize I possessed. I wasn't going to let anger drive this. Wasn't going to create drama or make emotional accusations. Just present facts calmly and let them speak louder than any amount of blame shifting could shout. The realization that I had this evidence, that it was organized and ready to present when the time came, let me sleep that night despite everything that had happened. I had a strategy now. I just needed to wait for the right moment to execute it. Days passed. The atmosphere in the office shifted noticeably around me. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. People who'd been friendly before became distant and formal. My inputs in meetings were ignored or spoken over by Pierce, who'd begun subtly rewriting history in public ways. As I mentioned to Elysia weeks ago, he'd say, referencing guidance he'd never given, despite my recommendations that she consider alternative approaches, when he'd actually approved my exact approach. Each rewriting of events was small, subtle enough that challenging it in the moment would make me look defensive and difficult. But together they created a pattern that reinforced his narrative, that he'd been trying to guide me properly and I'd been resistant or incompetent. I let him continue, didn't contradict him in meetings or send corrective emails. Just watched and noted each lie, each revision, each attempt to establish his false narrative more firmly. My silence confused him, I could tell. He'd expected me to fight back emotionally, to defend myself in ways that would make me look unprofessional. When I didn't, when I just stayed quiet and continued doing my work, it made him more confident, made him think his strategy had worked, that I'd accepted blame and moved on, that overconfidence would matter later. When he discovered his assumptions about my silence had been completely wrong about what I was actually doing during these quiet days of apparent acceptance. 2 weeks after the initial blame meeting, Pierce's assistant sent a calendar invite. Stratton post-mortem review with executive leadership. The official analysis of what had gone wrong and what changes needed to be made to prevent similar failures. Pierce was listed as the lead presenter. I was listed as an attendee. The meeting would include the VP of Operations, the Regional Director, the Head of Client Relations, and the Chief Operating Officer. Senior leadership who would make decisions about accountability and consequences based on whatever story this meeting told. Pierce seemed confident in the days leading up to this review. He'd successfully established his narrative about my failures over the past 2 weeks. Had positioned himself as the disappointed leader trying to manage a problematic team member. Thought he'd finished burying me professionally. I knew because of how he spoke to me in the brief interactions we had. Almost kindly now, like he was being generous by not pushing for my immediate termination. Like I should be grateful he was giving me a chance to learn from my mistakes and possibly rehabilitate my career over time. That patronizing kindness told me he genuinely believed he'd won. Believed the story was settled, and this post-mortem would be a formality that confirmed what everyone already accepted. He had no idea what was actually coming. Had no idea I'd spent 2 weeks organizing documentation he'd apparently forgotten existed. Had no idea his narrative was about to hit evidence that would shatter it completely. I accepted the meeting invite without comment, and started preparing my own materials for what would actually happen in that conference room. I didn't present my documentation publicly or dramatically. Didn't schedule my own meeting or send confrontational emails demanding my side be heard. Instead, I used the proper channels that existed for exactly this kind of situation. Cascade had a compliance and accuracy requirement for all post-mortem reviews. Any team member involved in a failed project could submit clarifying documentation to be included in the official record. It was meant to ensure complete pictures of what had happened rather than single perspectives. I submitted my timeline and supporting documentation through that formal channel, framed as clarification regarding decision approval chain and communication timeline. No accusations. No emotional language. Just, attached, please find relevant communications and approvals related to the Stratton contract process for inclusion in the post-mortem review. Attached the chronological timeline I'd built. The emails. The approval confirmations. The status reports with my warnings and Pierce's responses. Everything organized clearly with dates and context. Sent it to the review committee 3 days before the scheduled meeting, giving them time to review it before Pierce made his presentation. The submission was professional, complete, and devastating to Pierce's narrative without me needing to say a single accusatory word. The facts spoke for themselves. I just needed to make sure those facts were in front of the people making decisions about what had actually happened and who was responsible. Then I waited to see how senior leadership would respond when Pierce's story met documentation that contradicted it completely. The night before the post-mortem review, I slept surprisingly well. Better than I had in weeks. There was no anxiety about what would happen tomorrow. No fear about how the meeting might go or whether I'd be believed. Because whatever happened, it wouldn't be chaotic or unpredictable. It would be precise. Pierce would present his version of events, the narrative he'd been building about my failures and his attempts to guide me properly. Then leadership would compare that narrative to the documentation I'd submitted showing what had actually been discussed, decided, and approved. One of two things would happen. Either they'd believe evidence over story or they wouldn't. If they believed the documentation, Pierce's credibility would be destroyed by his own lies. If they didn't, if they chose to accept his word over clear evidence, then I'd know exactly what kind of company Cascade actually was and could make decisions accordingly. Either outcome was clean, clear, based on facts rather than politics or who was better at emotional manipulation. That clarity let me sleep peacefully. Let me wake up the next morning calm and focused rather than anxious and defensive. I dressed carefully for the meeting. Professional, composed, ready to sit quietly while the truth I'd documented did the work I couldn't do through arguing or defending myself emotionally. Ready to see whether facts actually mattered more than authority when they came into direct conflict. By the time I walked into that conference room, I felt steady in ways I hadn't since the moment Pierce had first blamed me publicly. The executives gathered exactly on time. The VP of Operations, the regional director, the head of client relations, and the COO who joined specifically for this high-profile review. They sat at the main conference table with laptops open, clearly having reviewed materials in advance. Pierce arrived looking confident and prepared. He'd dressed sharply, carried a polished presentation deck, moved to the front of the room with the easy authority of someone who controlled this narrative and expected confirmation of his version of events. I sat in the back row of seats along the wall, positioned as an attendee rather than a presenter. Exactly where Pierce had probably wanted me. Visible enough that my presence acknowledged my role, but not positioned as someone whose input mattered to the discussion. Pierce began his presentation smoothly, walked through the Stratton deal timeline according to his version, explained how he'd provided guidance that wasn't followed, how concerning decisions had been made without proper approval, how warnings he'd given had been ignored, leading directly to the contract collapse. His delivery was polished, rehearsed, backed by slides that showed impact and consequences without delving too deeply into the specific decision points where his story would fall apart. I watched his hands as he presented, clicked through slides, gestured to emphasize points. They didn't shake, didn't show any nervousness or concern. He genuinely believed this would go exactly as he'd planned. That confidence was about to become his biggest vulnerability. The first crack came from the VP of Operations, a woman named Francine who had a reputation for precision and dislike of ambiguity. Pierce had just finished explaining his version of the approval process when she interrupted. "You mentioned providing explicit guidance about the contract terms. Can you give me the specific date when that guidance was communicated to Elysia?" Pierce paused for just a fraction of a second. "It was during our initial review of the contract. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it was approximately 3 weeks before signing. And that guidance was documented in email or meeting notes?" Francine asked. Another slight pause. "It was a verbal discussion in my office. But I made my recommendations clear. So there's no written record of you recommending changes to the contract terms before they were finalized?" Pierce's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Not every discussion needs to be documented in writing. Sometimes leadership guidance is given in person during the normal course of business. Francine nodded slowly. Then she opened her laptop and started scrolling through something. "I'm looking at the supplemental documentation submitted for this review. There's an email from Elysia to you dated 3 weeks before contract signing. She outlines several concerns about the proposed terms and recommends negotiating modifications before proceeding. Do you recall receiving this email?" The room went very still. Pierce's hands, which had been relaxed and steady, tightened slightly on the edge of the table. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched as the first piece of evidence landed in direct contradiction to the story he'd been telling. Francine continued reading from her screen. Alicia's email lists specific concerns about delivery timelines, margin compression, and penalty structures. She recommends negotiating changes to protect company interests while maintaining client relationship. Then she says. Francine paused, scrolling slightly. She says, "Please let me know if you'd like me to schedule a meeting to discuss these concerns before we proceed with signing." Pierce cleared his throat. "Yes, I remember that email. That's the hesitancy I mentioned in my presentation. Alicia was consistently resistant to closing deals aggressively." "Your response to her email," Francine interrupted, still reading from her screen, "was sent the same day. You wrote, 'Confirmed. We can absorb the margin compression and meet the timeline. Proceed with signing this week. Legal has already reviewed the penalty structures and approved them." She looked up from her laptop directly at Pierce. "That doesn't sound like you recommended modifications. That sounds like you approved the contract terms exactly as the client proposed them, despite Alicia flagging multiple concerns." The timeline appeared on the main presentation screen as someone else on the executive team pulled up the documentation I'd submitted. Emails displayed chronologically. My concerns. Pierce's approvals. Status reports showing emerging problems. Pierce's responses telling me to manage issues rather than renegotiate terms. The room leaned forward collectively. Not dramatically but noticeably. Their attention shifting from Pierce's polished narrative to evidence that contradicted it completely. I watched the narrative shift happen in real time. Watched Pierce's authority drain as facts replaced his story. Watched executives begin reassessing everything they'd been told about the situation. Pierce tried to explain. Started talking faster, words piling up as he attempted to provide context that would reconcile his narrative with the evidence now on the screen in front of everyone. "That email doesn't capture the full conversation. What I meant was that we should proceed after addressing the concerns Alicia had raised in our earlier discussions, which she apparently didn't understand. The approval was conditional on her making the modifications we'd talked about verbally, which clearly weren't implemented properly." "There's no email documenting conditional approval," the COO interrupted, his voice calm but sharp. "Your response specifically says to proceed with signing that week. If the approval was conditional, wouldn't you have listed those conditions in writing?" Pierce's voice tightened with stress he couldn't quite hide anymore. "Not every condition needs to be spelled out in email. Sometimes there's implicit understanding between a manager and their team member about expectations. The status reports Alicia sent weekly," Francine cut in, pulling up another document on screen, "all flag problems with the timeline you approved. In each report, she outlines emerging challenges and requests guidance on whether to renegotiate with the client. Your responses consistently tell her to find solutions and manage expectations without authorizing any renegotiation. That doesn't support your claim that you told her to modify terms before signing. Dates didn't match. Instructions Pierce claimed to have given weren't documented anywhere. Instead, documentation showed the opposite. Him approving risky terms despite warnings, then directing his team member to make impossible timelines work through better management. His voice was getting higher now. Tighter. The polished confidence he'd carried into this meeting had evaporated, replaced by visible stress as his story collapsed under the weight of evidence he'd apparently forgotten existed. Leadership stopped looking at me entirely. Their attention was focused completely on Pierce now, watching him carefully, critically, assessing not just what had happened with the Stratton deal, but what his lies in this meeting revealed about his character and judgment. The regional director spoke for the first time. His tone measured but pointed. "Pierce, I'm struggling to reconcile your presentation about Alicia's failures with the documentation showing you approved every decision she made. Can you help me understand that disconnect?" Pierce's hands moved restlessly, adjusting papers on the table that didn't need adjusting. The issue is that approving a direction doesn't mean approving poor execution. I provided the strategic vision, but Elysia failed in the tactical implementation. The tactical implementation you're describing, the COO interrupted, appears to be trying to meet a 6-week delivery timeline that you approved over Elysia's explicit recommendation that it was unrealistic. Is that accurate? The timeline was aggressive but achievable with proper project management, which Elysia flagged in 3 separate status reports as not achievable with current resources, Francine added, pulling up another document. And in each case, you responded that she needed to find creative solutions rather than authorizing additional resources or timeline renegotiation. The room had shifted completely. What started as a postmortem about my failures had become an examination of Pierce's decision-making and his subsequent attempt to blame someone else for consequences of his own choices. I still hadn't spoken. Hadn't needed to. The documentation was doing all the work, answering every question, contradicting every claim Pierce made. His lies were becoming more obvious with each attempt to explain away evidence that directly contradicted his narrative. The most damaging question came from the head of client relations, a quiet man named Bernard who'd been reviewing documents on his tablet throughout the meeting. Pierce, why did you blame Elysia publicly in our initial meeting if you'd approved all these decisions yourself? Silence filled the room. Everyone stopped and looked at Pierce, waiting for an answer to the question that cut to the heart of what this was actually about. Not mistakes or failures, but deliberate scapegoating. Pierce opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I didn't blame her. I was trying to provide context about decision-making on the project. You specifically said she mishandled the deal despite multiple warnings, Bernard read from his own notes. That's not providing context. That's assigning fault. For decisions the documentation shows you made, and she questioned. Leadership needed accountability, Pierce finally said, his voice strained. When a deal fails this badly, someone has to take responsibility. Given the chain of command, the COO interrupted coldly. The person who approves risky decisions over their team members' objections is responsible for the outcomes of those decisions. Not the team member who documented their concerns and followed directives from their superior. No one was defending Pierce now. No one was suggesting there might be nuance or complexity that would explain the contradiction between his story and the evidence. They'd seen what I'd seen. Deliberate lies designed to protect himself by sacrificing someone else. And they'd seen it proven through documentation he'd either forgotten about or assumed wouldn't be used against him. Pierce had no answer to Bernard's question. No explanation for why he'd blamed me publicly when he'd made the decisions himself. The silence that followed that non-answer was more damaging than any accusation could have been. The meeting ended without drama. No one raised their voice or made overt accusations. No one needed to. Authority and credibility drained from Pierce in real time as executives processed the gap between what he'd claimed and what evidence proved. We'll need to revisit the accountability structure around this failure, the COO said formally. Thank you everyone for your time. Pierce, please remain available for follow-up discussions with leadership. The dismissal in that statement was clear even though it was professionally phrased. Pierce was being set aside. His judgment and honesty now questioned by the same executives who'd accepted his narrative unchallenged 2 weeks ago. People gathered their materials and filed out quietly. I walked back to my desk feeling strange. Not triumphant exactly. Not celebratory. Just clear. The truth was out. Not because I'd argued passionately or defended myself emotionally, but because facts documented carefully spoke louder than lies told confidently. I'd proven what actually happened. Let evidence contradict Pierce's narrative so completely that his credibility had shattered against reality. And I'd done it without raising my voice, without making accusations, without creating drama. Just by preserving truth and presenting it clearly when the moment came. That approach, calm, documented, precise, had been more powerful than any amount of emotional defending could have been. It had let Pierce destroy his own credibility through his attempts to deny what evidence proved undeniably. Watching that happen had been difficult and satisfying simultaneously. Justice delivered through paperwork rather than confrontation. The aftermath unfolded quietly over the following days. Pierce avoided me completely. Wouldn't make eye contact in hallways. Stopped attending meetings where I was present. His office door stayed closed most of the time. Leadership, in contrast, started treating me differently. Francine stopped by my desk the day after the postmortem. "Thank you for your clarity in documenting the Stratton timeline. That level of detail was invaluable for understanding what actually happened." The COO sent an email thanking me for my professional handling of a difficult situation and commitment to factual accuracy. Not direct apologies for believing Pierce's lies initially, but acknowledgement that something had been wrong and I'd been treated unfairly. The office temperature changed overnight. People who'd been avoiding me suddenly became friendly again. Colleagues apologized quietly for their distance. My inputs in meetings were listened to carefully now instead of being dismissed. I'd gone from liability to respected in the space of a single presentation. Not through my own advocacy, but through documentation that proved Pierce had lied. The shift was gratifying but also slightly sad. It revealed how quickly people had been willing to believe the worst about me based solely on authority figures' word. How little investigation had happened before I'd been condemned socially and professionally. But it also proved that truth, presented clearly and irrefutably, could overcome even established narrative from someone with more power. That evidence could shift opinions that seemed settled. That documentation was more powerful than charisma or seniority when they came into direct conflict. 3 weeks after the postmortem, Pierce was quietly removed from his oversight role. He wasn't fired. Cascade rarely fired directors outright unless absolutely necessary. But he was reassigned to a position with less authority and no direct reports. Not described as a demotion officially, but everyone understood what it actually was. Punishment through diminishment. Consequences delivered through removal of the status and power he'd misused to blame someone else for his own failures. Worse than being fired in some ways, because he remained visible in the organization as a cautionary tale. Someone who'd lost trust and credibility through dishonesty and scapegoating. Someone whose career trajectory had been permanently altered by his choice to lie rather than accept accountability. I heard through office gossip that he'd tried to resign initially. That leadership had refused his resignation, insisting he remain in the diminished role rather than being allowed to leave on his own terms. They wanted the consequences visible, apparently. Wanted it clear what happened when leaders blamed subordinates for their own mistakes. The punishment wasn't about being vindictive. It was about setting standards. Establishing that documentation mattered. That honesty was expected. That authority didn't protect you from consequences when you deliberately lied to save yourself at someone else's expense. Pierce's visible consequences sent messages through the organization about what leadership actually valued. And one of those messages was that what had happened to me wouldn't be tolerated. That truth supported by evidence would be believed over authority unsupported by facts. A month after the postmortem, I was asked to meet with the COO and the VP of operations. I walked into that meeting uncertain what to expect. Another review, possibly, or questions about my future plans at Cascade. Instead, I received an offer. A promotion to director level in a newly created role overseeing risk management and contract review for major deals. Broader leadership responsibility. Significant pay increase. Authority to implement better processes and oversight. Your handling of the Stratton situation demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and integrity we need in leadership, the COO explained. The way you documented everything, presented facts without drama, and maintained professionalism throughout a difficult situation impressed us considerably. It wasn't an explicit apology for initially believing Pierce's lies, but it was acknowledgement through action rather than words. Recognition that I'd been treated unfairly and deserved opportunity to advance based on actual competence rather than being held back by someone else's dishonesty. Accepted the role. Not as vindication exactly, though there was satisfaction in being promoted while the person who tried to destroy my career was being diminished. More as confirmation that the approach I'd chosen, calm documentation rather than emotional defense, had been right. That preserving truth and presenting it clearly had protected me more effectively than any other strategy could have. The promotion came with no requirement for me to make speeches about what had happened or publicly accept apologies. Just quiet correction of an injustice through opportunity I'd earned and deserved. That felt appropriate somehow. Fitting with how this entire situation had resolved, through facts and actions rather than dramatic confrontations or emotional reconciliations. I walked past Pierce's new office one afternoon a few weeks later. The small interior space without windows that was such a stark contrast to the corner office he'd occupied when he'd been a director with authority and influence. He was at his desk, staring at his computer. Our eyes met briefly through the glass wall. He looked away immediately. Couldn't hold my gaze. Couldn't maintain the confidence and superiority he'd projected when he'd been blaming me publicly and privately. He knew I'd never attacked him directly. Never made emotional accusations or demanded apologies or tried to humiliate him publicly. I just presented truth he'd apparently forgotten was documented. Let him contradict himself. Let evidence reveal his lies more effectively than any accusation from me could have. The realization that he'd destroyed his own career through his dishonesty while I'd simply remembered what actually happened, that knowledge sat between us in that brief eye contact. He was diminished not by my actions but by his own choices. By his decision to lie when truth was documented. By his assumption that authority would protect him from consequences when it actually just made his dishonesty more damaging when revealed. I felt no satisfaction looking at him in that smaller office. No victory or joy in his consequences. Just a kind of neutral completion. He'd tried to sacrifice me to protect himself. The truth had proven otherwise. And now we were both dealing with the actual reality of what had happened, rather than the fiction he'd tried to create. That seemed like justice enough without requiring any additional vindication or acknowledgement from him personally. Looking back now, 6 months later and settled into my director role, I understand what actually happened during that period. Pierce had tried to rewrite history through confident lies. Had assumed that authority and narrative control would overcome evidence he'd forgotten existed or assumed wouldn't be used. I'd won if protecting yourself from false blame counts as winning, not by shouting louder or fighting harder emotionally, but by remembering who I actually was, by keeping records professionally, by staying steady while someone else unraveled under the weight of their own dishonesty. The paper trail hadn't just cleared my name. It had proven I belonged exactly where I stood.